This is a photograph of Lyndon B. Johnson in front of a chalkboard. Figure 31. 1. President Lyndon B. Johnson. President Lyndon Johnson played a pivotal role in financing higher education. Credit: Modification of Lyndon Johnson in 1970 by LBJ Museum and Library, public domain. Chapter Objectives. In this chapter, you will learn about how government borrowing affects investment and the trade balance, fiscal policy, investment and economic growth, how government borrowing affects private saving, fiscal policy and the trade balance. Bring it home. Financing higher education. On November 8, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Higher Education Act of 1965 into law. With a stroke of the pen, he implemented what we know as the financial aid, work-study, and student loan programs to help Americans pay for a college education. In his remarks, the president said, "Here the seeds were planted from which grew my firm conviction that, for the individual, education is the path to achievement and fulfillment. For the nation, it is a path to a society that is not only free but civilized. And for the world, it is the path to peace, for it is education that places reason over force." This act, he said, is responsible for funding higher education for millions of Americans. It is the embodiment of the United States' investment in human capital. Since Johnson signed the act into law, the government has renewed it several times. The purpose of the Higher Education Act of 1965 was to build the country's human capital by creating educational opportunity for millions of Americans. The three criteria that the government uses to judge eligibility are income, full-time or part-time attendance, and the cost of the institution. According to Education.org, in the 2011-2012 school year, over 80% of all full-time college students received some form of federal financial aid. 43% received grants, and another 41% of students aged 15-23 received federal government student loans. The budget to support financial aid has increased not only because of more enrollment, but also because of increased tuition and fees for higher education. In 2022, the government generally took an approach of increasing student aid through programs such as Pell Grant expansion, while also taking steps to ease student loan debt. Governments have many competing demands for financial support. Any spending should be tempered by fiscal responsibility and by looking carefully at the spending's impact. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it runs a budget deficit. It then needs to borrow. When government borrowing becomes especially large and sustained, it can substantially reduce the financial capital available to private sector firms, as well as lead to trade imbalances and even financial crises. The Government Budgets and Fiscal Policy chapter introduced the concepts of deficits and debt, as well as how a government could use fiscal policy to address recession or inflation. This chapter begins by building on the national savings and investment identity, which we first introduced in the International Trade and Capital Flows chapter, to show how government borrowing affects firms' physical capital investment levels and trade balances. A prolonged period of budget deficits may lead to lower economic growth, in part because the funds that the government borrows to fund its budget deficits are typically no longer available for private investment. Moreover, a sustained pattern of large budget deficits can lead to disruptive economic patterns of high inflation, substantial inflows of financial capital from abroad, plummeting exchange rates, and heavy strains on a country's banking and financial system. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the national saving and investment identity in terms of demand and supply, evaluate the role of budget surpluses and trade surpluses in national saving and investment identity. When governments are borrowers in financial markets, there are three possible sources for the funds from a macroeconomic point of view. 1. Households might save more. 2. Private firms might borrow less. And 3. The additional funds for government borrowing might come from outside the country, from foreign financial investors. Let's begin with a review of why one of these three options must occur, and then explore how interest rates and exchange rates adjust to these connections. The National Saving and Investment Identity. The National Saving and Investment Identity, which we first introduced in the International Trade and Capital Flows chapter, provides a framework for showing the relationships between the sources of demand and supply in financial capital markets. The identity begins with a statement that must always hold true. The quantity of financial capital supplied in the market must equal the quantity of financial capital demanded. The U.S. economy has two main sources for financial capital: private savings from inside the U.S. economy and public savings. Total savings equals private savings S plus public savings TG. These include the inflow of foreign financial capital from abroad. The inflow of savings from abroad is, by definition, equal to the trade deficit, as we explained in the International Trade and Capital Flows chapter. We can write this inflow of foreign investment capital as imports M minus exports X. There are also two main sources of demand for financial capital: private sector investment I and government borrowing. Government borrowing in any given year is equal to the budget deficit, which we can write as the difference between government spending G and net taxes T. Let's call this equation 1. Quantity supplied of financial capital private savings plus inflow of foreign savings S plus MX equals quantity demanded of financial capital private investment plus government budget deficit I plus GT. Governments often spend more than they receive in taxes, and therefore public savings TG is negative. This causes a need to borrow money in the amount of GT instead of adding to the nation's savings. If this is the case, we can view governments as demanders of financial capital instead of suppliers. In algebraic terms, we can rewrite the national savings and investment identity like this. Private investment I equals private savings plus public savings plus trade deficit S plus TG plus MX. Let's call this equation 2. We must accompany a change in any part of the national saving and investment identity by offsetting changes in at least one other part of the equation, because we assume that the equality of quantity supplied and quantity demanded always holds. If the government budget deficit changes, then either private saving or investment or the trade balance, or some combination of the three, must change as well. Figure 31.2 shows the possible effects. Following from the national savings and investment identity, charts A and B show what happens to investment, private savings, and the trade deficit when the budget deficit rises or the budget surplus falls. A. If the budget deficit rises or the government budget surplus falls, the results could be 1. Domestic private investment falls, or 2. Private savings rise, or 3. The trade deficit increases, or a trade surplus diminishes. The opposite results of each are achieved when the budget deficit falls or the budget surplus rises, as shown in image B. Figure 31. Two effects of change in budget surplus or deficit on investment, savings, and the trade balance chart. A shows the potential results when the budget deficit rises or budget surplus falls. Chart B shows the potential results when the budget deficit falls or budget surplus rises. What about budget surpluses and trade surpluses? The national saving and investment identity must always hold true because, by definition, the quantity supplied and quantity demanded in the financial capital market must always be equal. However, the formula will look somewhat different if the government budget is in deficit rather than surplus, or if the balance of trade is in surplus rather than deficit. For example, in 1999 and 2000, the U.S. government had budget surpluses, although the economy was still experiencing trade deficits. When the government was running budget surpluses, it was acting as a saver rather than a borrower, and supplying rather than demanding financial capital. As a result, we would write the national saving and investment identity during this time as quantity supplied of financial capital private savings plus trade deficit plus government surplus S plus MX TG equals quantity demanded of financial capital private investment time. Let's call this equation 3. Notice that this expression is mathematically the same as equation 2, except the savings and investment sides of the identity have simply flipped sides. During the 1960s, the U.S. government was often running a budget deficit, but the economy was typically running trade surpluses. Since a trade surplus means that an economy is experiencing a net outflow of financial capital, we would write the national saving and investment identity as quantity supplied of financial capital private savings, S equals quantity demanded of financial capital private investment, plus outflow of foreign savings plus government budget deficit I plus X, M, plus GT. Instead of the balance of trade, representing part of the supply of financial capital, which occurs with a trade deficit. A trade surplus represents an outflow of financial capital leaving the domestic economy and invested elsewhere in the world. Quantity supplied of financial capital private savings, S equals quantity demanded of financial capital demand private investment, plus government budget deficit plus trade surplus I plus GT plus X, M. We assume that the point to these equations is that the national saving and investment identity always hold. When you write these relationships, it is important to engage your brain and think about what is on the supply and demand side of the financial capital market before you start your calculations. As you can see in Figure 31. 3. The Office of Management and Budget shows that the United States has consistently run budget deficits since 1977, with the exception of 1999 and 2000. What is alarming is the dramatic increase in budget deficits that has occurred since 2008, which in part reflects declining tax revenues and increased safety net expenditures due to the Great Recession. While deficits were controlled as the economy began to recover in the mid-2010s, the budget deficit increased again in 2020 during the pandemic, and forecasters expect deficits to remain high for the foreseeable future. Recall that T is net taxes. When the government must transfer funds back to individuals for safety net expenditures like Social Security and unemployment benefits, budget deficits rise. These deficits have implications for the future health of the U.S. economy. This graph is a bar chart illustrating for each year whether the U.S. federal government runs a budget surplus or a budget deficit. The y-axis measures the federal surplus or deficit in billions of dollars from $3,500 billion or $3.5 trillion to $500 billion in increments of $500 billion. The x-axis shows years from 1952 to 2020. From 1952 to the early 1980s, the budget is either balanced or shows a very small deficit of no more than around $50 billion. There are deficits in the 1980s and early 1990s, but from 1997 to 2001, there is a budget surplus. There are budget deficits in all the remaining years. They are over $1,000 billion 2009 to 2012. Then the deficits shrink to under $500 billion in 2015. Then deficits grow again yearly to nearly $1,000 billion in 2019 and over $3,000 billion or $3 trillion in 2020. Figure 31. 3 United States on budget, surplus, and deficit, 1952-2020. Billions. The United States has run a budget deficit for over 30 years, with the exception of 1999 and 2000. Military expenditures, entitlement programs, and the decrease in tax revenue coupled with increased safety net support during the Great Recession are major contributors to the dramatic increases in the deficit after 2008. Source: Office of Management and Budget, https Fred, St. Louis, Org Series FYFSGDA 188S. A rising budget deficit may result in a fall in domestic investment, a rise in private savings, or a rise in the trade deficit. The following modules discuss each of these possible effects in more detail. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss twin deficits as they related to budget and trade deficit. Explain the relationship between budget deficits and exchange rates. Explain the relationship between budget deficits and inflation. Identify causes of recessions. Government budget balances can affect the trade balance. As the Keynesian Perspective chapter discusses, a net inflow of foreign financial investment always accompanies a trade deficit, while a net outflow of financial investment always accompanies a trade surplus. One way to understand the connection from budget deficits to trade deficits is that when government creates a budget deficit with some combination of tax cuts or spending increases, it will increase aggregate demand in the economy, and some of that increase in aggregate demand will result in a higher level of imports. A higher level of imports, with exports remaining fixed, will cause a larger trade deficit. That means foreigners' holdings of dollars increase as Americans purchase more imported goods. Foreigners use those dollars to invest in the United States, which leads to an inflow of foreign investment. One possible source of funding our budget deficit is foreigners buying Treasury securities that the U.S. government sells. Thus, a trade deficit often accompanies a budget deficit. Twin deficits. In the mid-1980s, it was common to hear economists and even newspaper articles refer to the twin deficits, as the budget deficit and trade deficit both grew substantially. Figure 31.4 shows the pattern. The federal budget deficit went from 2.6% of GDP in 1981 to 5.1% of GDP in 1985, a drop of 2.5% of GDP. Over that time, the trade deficit moved from 0.5% in 1981 to 2.9% in 1985, a drop of 2.4% of GDP. In the mid-1980s, an inflow of foreign investment capital matched the considerable increase in government borrowing, so the government budget deficit and the trade deficit moved together. This graph illustrates two lines: the budget deficit and trade deficit as a percentage of GDP over time. The y-axis measures the percentage of GDP from 16 to 4% in increments of 2%. The x-axis measures years from 1980 to 2020. Notably, both lines are almost always negative. The budget deficit line is nearly always negative, representing a budget deficit. In 1980, it starts at around 2% of GDP, decreases to 5% in 1985, then increases to positive 2%, a budget surplus, in 2000. The budget deficit line then decreases to deficit, reaching 10% in 2009. The line remains in a deficit until 2020. The line increases to 2% in 2015, corresponding with a decrease in gross private savings. Then the line decreases, and the deficit increases to 15% in 2020. The trade deficit line is always negative, fluctuating between around 0.5% of GDP in 1980 to a low of 3% in 1987, a low of around 6% in 2005, and a low of 4% in 2020. Figure 31. For U.S. budget deficits and trade deficits in the 1980s, the budget deficit and the trade deficit declined at the same time. However, since then, the deficits have stopped being twins. The trade deficit grew smaller in the early 1990s as the budget deficit increased, and then the trade deficit grew larger in the late 1990s as the budget deficit turned into a surplus. In the first half of the 2000s, both budget and trade deficits increased. However, in 2009, the trade deficit declined as the budget deficit increased. Through the 2010s, the trade deficit remained relatively stable as the budget deficit declined. While the budget deficit increased in 2020, there has been hardly any change in the trade deficit. Of course, no one should expect the budget deficit and trade deficit to move in lockstep, because the other parts of the national saving and investment identity, investment and private savings, will often change as well. In the late 1990s, for example, the government budget balance turned from deficit to surplus, but the trade deficit remained large and growing. During this time, the inflow of foreign financial investment was supporting a surge of physical capital investment by U.S. firms. In the first half of the 2000s, the budget and trade deficits again increased together, but in 2009, the budget deficit increased while the trade deficit declined. Through the 2010s, as there were bigger changes in the budget deficit, the trade deficit remained stable. The budget deficit and the trade deficits are related to each other, but they are more like cousins than twins. Budget deficits and exchange rates. Exchange rates can also help to explain why budget deficits are linked to trade deficits. Figure 31.5 shows a situation using the exchange rate for the U.S. dollar measured in euros at the original equilibrium E0, where the demand for U.S. dollars D0 intersects with the supply of U.S. dollars S0 on the foreign exchange market. The exchange rate is 0.9 euros per U.S. dollar, and the equilibrium quantity traded in the market is $100 billion per day. Then, the U.S. budget deficit rises, and foreign financial investment provides the source of funds for that budget deficit. International financial investors, as a group, will demand more U.S. dollars on foreign exchange markets to purchase the U.S. government bonds, and they will supply fewer of the U.S. dollars that they already hold in these markets. Demand for U.S. dollars on the foreign exchange market shifts from D0 to D1, and the supply of U.S. dollars falls from S0 to S1. At the new equilibrium E1, the exchange rate has appreciated to 1.5 euros per dollar, while, in this example, the quantity of dollars traded remains the same. This graph shows the demand and supply of foreign currency. The y-axis shows the euro-US dollar exchange rate, and the x-axis shows the quantity of dollars traded. As explained in the text, a budget deficit raises the demand for dollars and lowers the supply of dollars because foreign investors want to purchase U.S. government debt. The result is a stronger exchange rate. Figure 31.5 budget deficits and exchange rates. Imagine that the U.S. government increases its borrowing, and the funds come from European financial investors. To purchase U.S. government bonds, those European investors will need to demand more U.S. dollars on foreign exchange markets, causing the demand for U.S. dollars to shift to the right from D0 to D1. European financial investors as a group will also be less likely to supply U.S. dollars to the foreign exchange markets, causing the supply of U.S. dollars to shift from S0 to S1. The equilibrium exchange rate strengthens from 0.9 euro dollar at E0 to 1.5 euros dollar at E1. A stronger exchange rate, of course, makes it more difficult for exporters to sell their goods abroad while making imports cheaper, so a trade deficit or a reduced trade surplus results. Thus, a budget deficit can easily result in an inflow of foreign financial capital, a stronger exchange rate, and a trade deficit. You can also imagine interest rates are driving the exchange rate appreciation. As we explained earlier in Figure 31.8, a budget deficit increases demand in markets for domestic financial capital, raising the domestic interest rate. A higher interest rate will attract an inflow of foreign financial capital and appreciate the exchange rate in response to the increase in demand for U.S. dollars by foreign investors and a decrease in supply of U.S. dollars. Because of higher interest rates in the United States, Americans find U.S. bonds more attractive than foreign bonds. When Americans are buying fewer foreign bonds, they are supplying fewer U.S. dollars. U.S. dollar appreciation leads to a larger trade deficit or reduced surplus. The connections between inflows of foreign investment capital, interest rates, and exchange rates are all just different ways of drawing the same economic connections. A larger budget deficit can result in a larger trade deficit, although do not expect the connection to be one-to-one. From budget deficits to international economic crisis, we lay out step by step the economic story of how an outflow of international financial capital can cause a deep recession in the exchange rates, an international capital flows chapter. When international financial investors decide to withdraw their funds from a country like Turkey, they increase the supply of the Turkish lira and reduce the demand for lira, depreciating the lira exchange rate. When firms and the government in a country like Turkey borrow money in international financial markets, they typically do so in stages. First, banks in Turkey borrow in a widely used currency like US dollars or euros, then convert those US dollars to lira, and then lend the money to borrowers in Turkey. If the lira's exchange rate value depreciates, then Turkey's banks will find it impossible to repay the international loans that are in US dollars or euros. The combination of less foreign investment capital and banks that are bankrupt can sharply reduce aggregate demand, which causes a deep recession. Many countries around the world have experienced this kind of recession. Along with Turkey in 2002, Mexico followed this general pattern in 1995. Thailand and countries across East Asia in 1997-1998, Russia in 1998, and Argentina in 2002. In many of these countries, large government budget deficits played a role in setting the stage for the financial crisis. A moderate increase in a budget deficit that leads to a moderate increase in a trade deficit, and a moderate appreciation of the exchange rate is not necessarily a cause for concern. However, beyond some point that is hard to define in advance, a series of large budget deficits can become a cause for concern among international investors. One reason for concern is that extremely large budget deficits mean that aggregate demand may shift so far to the right as to cause high inflation. The example of Turkey is a situation where very large budget deficits brought inflation rates well into double digits. In addition, very large budget deficits at some point begin to raise a fear that the government would not repay the borrowing. In the last 100 years, the government of Turkey has been unable to pay its debts and defaulted on its loans 4 times. Over the past 175 years, Brazil's government has been unable to pay its debts and defaulted on its loans 7 times. Venezuela, 9 times, and Argentina, 5 times. The risk of high inflation or a default on repaying international loans will worry international investors, since both factors imply that the rate of return on their investments in that country may end up lower than expected. If international investors start withdrawing the funds from a country rapidly, the scenario of less investment, a depreciated exchange rate, widespread bank failure, and deep recession can occur. The following Clear It Up feature explains other impacts of large deficits. Clear it up. What are the risks of chronic large deficits in the United States? If a government runs large budget deficits for a sustained period of time, what can go wrong? According to a recent Brookings Institution report, a key risk of a large budget deficit is that government debt may grow too high compared to the country's GDP growth. As debt grows, the national savings rate will decline, leaving less available in financial capital for private investment. The impact of chronically large budget deficits is as follows. As the population ages, there will be an increasing demand for government services that may cause higher government deficits. Government borrowing and its interest payments will pull resources away from domestic investment in human capital and physical capital that is essential to economic growth. Interest rates may start to rise so that the cost of financing government debt will rise as well, creating pressure on the government to reduce its budget deficits through spending cuts and tax increases. These steps will be politically painful, and they will also have a contractionary effect on aggregate demand in the economy. Rising percentage of debt to GDP will create uncertainty in the financial and global markets that might cause a country to resort to inflationary tactics to reduce the real value of the debt outstanding. This will decrease real wealth and damage confidence in the country's ability to manage its spending. After all, if the government has borrowed at a fixed interest rate of, say, 5%, and it lets inflation rise above that 5%, then it will effectively be able to repay its debt at a negative real interest rate. The conventional reasoning suggests that the relationship between sustained deficits that lead to high levels of government debt and long-term growth is negative. How significant this relationship is, how big an issue it is compared to other macroeconomic issues, and the direction of causality is less clear. What remains important to acknowledge is that the relationship between debt and growth is negative, and that for some countries, the relationship may be stronger than in others. It is also important to acknowledge the direction of causality. Does high debt cause slow growth cause high debt, or are both high debt and slow growth the result of third factors? In our analysis, we have argued simply that high debt causes slow growth. There may be more to this debate than we have space to discuss here. Using fiscal policy to address trade imbalances. If a nation is experiencing the inflow of foreign investment capital associated with a trade deficit because foreign investors are making long-term direct investments in firms, there may be no substantial reason for concern. After all, many low-income nations around the world would welcome direct investment by multinational firms that ties them more closely into the global networks of production and distribution of goods and services. In this case, the inflows of foreign investment capital and the trade deficit are attracted by the opportunities for a good rate of return on private sector investment in an economy. However, governments should beware of a sustained pattern of high budget deficits and high trade deficits. The danger arises in particular when the inflow of foreign investment capital is not funding long-term physical capital investment by firms, but instead is short-term portfolio investment in government bonds. When inflows of foreign financial investment reach high levels, foreign financial investors will be on the alert for any reason to fear that the country's exchange rate may decline, or the government may be unable to repay what it has borrowed on time. Just as a few falling rocks can trigger an avalanche, a relatively small piece of bad news about an economy can trigger an enormous outflow of short-term financial capital. Reducing a nation's budget deficit will not always be a successful method of reducing its trade deficit, because other elements of the national saving and investment identity, like private saving or investment, may change instead. In those cases when the budget deficit is the main cause of the trade deficit, governments should take steps to reduce their budget deficits, lest they make their economy vulnerable to a rapid outflow of international financial capital that could bring a deep recession. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to apply Ricardian equivalence to evaluate how government borrowing affects private saving. Interpret a graphic representation of Ricardian equivalence. A change in government budgets may impact private saving. Imagine that people watch government budgets and adjust their savings accordingly. For example, whenever the government runs a budget deficit, people might reason, well, a higher budget deficit means that I'm just going to owe more taxes in the future to pay off all that government borrowing, so I'll start saving now. If the government runs budget surpluses, people might reason, With these budget surpluses or lower budget deficits, interest rates are falling so that saving is less attractive. Moreover, with a budget surplus, the country will be able to afford a tax cut sometime in the future. I won't bother saving as much now. The theory that rational private households might shift their saving to offset government saving or borrowing is known as Ricardian equivalence, because the idea has intellectual roots in the writings of the early 19th century economist David Ricardo, 1772, 1823. If Ricardian equivalence holds completely true, then in the national saving and investment identity, any change in budget deficits or budget surpluses would be completely offset by a corresponding change in private saving. As a result, changes in government borrowing would have no effect at all on either physical capital investment or trade balances. In practice, the private sector only sometimes and partially adjusts its savings behavior to offset government budget deficits and surpluses. Figure 31.6 shows the patterns of U.S. government budget deficits and surpluses and the rate of private saving, which includes saving by both households and firms, since 1980. The connection between the two is not at all obvious. In the mid-1980s, for example, government budget deficits were quite large, but there is no corresponding surge of private saving. However, when budget deficits turn to surpluses in the late 1990s, there is a simultaneous decline in private saving. When budget deficits got very large in 2008 and 2009, there was another rise in saving. When the deficit increased again in 2020, saving jumped up as well. A variety of statistical studies based on the U.S. experience suggests that when government borrowing increases by $1, private saving rises by about 30 cents. A World Bank study from the late 1990s, looking at government budgets and private saving behavior in countries around the world, found a similar result. This graph illustrates two lines: gross private savings and budget deficit or surplus as a percentage of GDP over time. The y-axis shows the percentage of GDP from 20 to 35 in increments of 5%. The x-axis shows years from 1980 to 2020. The two lines generally move in opposite directions as the government budget deficit increases, meaning the line becomes more negative, gross private savings increases, and as the government budget deficit decreases, meaning the line becomes more positive, gross private savings decreases. Gross private savings is always positive and is above the budget deficit or surplus line. It starts in 1980 at around 22% of GDP and fluctuates over time between 17 and 25% until 2020. It peaks in the mid-1980s at around 25% and is at a low of around 15% in 2000. The budget deficit or surplus line is nearly always negative, representing a budget deficit. In 1980, it starts at around 2% of GDP, decreases to 5% in 1985, then increases to positive 1%. A budget surplus in 2000, which corresponds to when gross private savings is at its lowest. The budget deficit or surplus line then decreases to deficit, reaching 10% in 2009, which is when gross private savings is at one of its peaks of 25%. The line remains in a deficit until 2020. The line increases to 2% in 2015, corresponding with a decrease in gross private savings. Then the line decreases, and the deficit increases to 15% in 2020. In 2020, gross private savings spikes to 30%. Figure 31.6 U.S. budget deficits and private savings. The theory of Ricardian equivalence suggests that additional private saving will offset any increase in government borrowing, while reduced private saving will offset any decrease in government borrowing. Sometimes this theory holds true, and sometimes it does not. Source: Bureau of Economic Analysis and Federal Reserve Economic Data. Private saving does increase to some extent when governments run large budget deficits, and private saving falls when governments reduce deficits or run large budget surpluses. However, the offsetting effects of private saving compared to government borrowing are much less than one-to-one. In addition, this effect can vary a great deal from country to country, from time to time, and over the short and the long run. If the funding for a larger budget deficit comes from international financial investors, then a trade deficit may accompany a budget deficit. In some countries, this pattern of twin deficits has set the stage for international financial investors first to send their funds to a country and cause an appreciation of its exchange rate, and then to pull their funds out and cause a depreciation of the exchange rate and a financial crisis as well. It depends on whether funding comes from international financial investors. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain crowding out and its effect on physical capital investment. Explain the relationship between budget deficits and interest rates. Identify why economic growth is tied to investments in physical capital, human capital, and technology. The underpinnings of economic growth are investments in physical capital, human capital, and technology, all set in an economic environment where firms and individuals can react to the incentives provided by well-functioning markets and flexible prices. Government borrowing can reduce the financial capital available for private firms to invest in physical capital. However, government spending can also encourage certain elements of long-term growth, such as spending on roads or water systems, on education, or on research and development that creates new technology. Crowding out physical capital investment. A larger budget deficit will increase demand for financial capital. If private saving and the trade balance remain the same, then less financial capital will be available for private investment in physical capital. When government borrowing soaks up available financial capital and leaves less for private investment in physical capital, economists call the result crowding out. To understand the potential impact of crowding out, consider the U.S. economy's situation before the exceptional circumstances of the recession that started in late 2007. In 2005, for example, the budget deficit was roughly 3% of GDP. Private investment by firms in the U.S. economy has hovered in the range of 14% to 18% of GDP in recent decades. However, in any given year, roughly half of U.S. investment in physical capital just replaces machinery and equipment that has worn out or become technologically obsolete. Only about half represents an increase in the total quantity of physical capital in the economy. Investment in new physical capital in any year is about 7% to 9% of GDP. In this situation, even U.S. budget deficits in the range of 3% of GDP can potentially crowd out a substantial share of new investment spending. Conversely, a smaller budget deficit or an increased budget surplus increases the pool of financial capital available for private investment. Link it up. Visit this website to view the U.S. debt clock. Figure 31.7 shows the patterns of U.S. budget deficits and private investment since 1980. If greater government deficits lead to less private investment in physical capital, and reduced government deficits or budget surpluses lead to more investment in physical capital, these two lines should move up and down simultaneously. This pattern occurred in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The U.S. federal budget went from a deficit of 2% of GDP in 1995 to a budget surplus of 2.4% of GDP in 2000, a swing of 4.6% of GDP. From 1995 to 2000, private investment in physical capital rose from 15% to 18% of GDP, a rise of 3% of GDP. Then, when the U.S. government again started running budget deficits in the early 2000s, less financial capital became available for private investment, and the rate of private investment fell back to about 15% of GDP by 2003. However, in more recent years, in the 2010s, after the economy recovered from the Great Recession, private investment as a share of GDP increased even as deficits slightly worsened, especially around 2016. And while the deficit increased substantially in 2020, private investment as a share of GDP did not. This graph illustrates two lines: private investment as a percentage of GDP and budget deficits or surpluses as a percentage of GDP. Each is measured over time. The y-axis shows the percentage of GDP from 15 to 25 in increments of 5%. The x-axis shows years from 1980 to 2020. The two lines generally move together. Private investment is always positive and is above the budget deficit or surplus line. It starts in 1980 at around 19% of GDP and fluctuates over time between 15 and 20%. It peaks at 20% in 2000 and is at a low of 15% in 2009. The budget deficit or surplus line is nearly always negative, representing a budget deficit. In 1980, it starts at around 2% of GDP, decreases to 5% in 1985, then increases to positive 1%, a budget surplus, in 2000, which corresponds to when private investment is at its peak. The budget deficit or surplus line then decreases to deficit, reaching 10% in 2009, which is when private investment is at its lowest. The line remains in a deficit until 2020. The line increases to 2% in 2015, corresponding with an increase in private investment. Then the line decreases and the deficit increases to 15% in 2020. Figure 31. 7 U.S. Budget deficit surpluses and private investment. The connection between private savings and flows of international capital plays a role in budget deficits and surpluses. Consequently, government borrowing and private investment sometimes rise and fall together. For example, the 1990s show a pattern in which reduced government borrowing helped to reduce crowding out so that more funds were available for private investment. This argument does not claim that a government's budget deficits will exactly shadow its national rate of private investment. After all, we must account for private saving and inflows of foreign financial investment. In the mid-1980s, for example, government budget deficits increased substantially without a corresponding drop-off in private investment. In 2009, non-residential private fixed investment dropped by $300 billion from its previous level of $1,941 billion in 2008, primarily because, during a recession, firms lack both the funds and the incentive to invest. Investment growth between 2009 and 2014 averaged approximately 5.9% to $2,210, $5 billion, only slightly above its 2008 level, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. During that same period, interest rates dropped from 3.94% to less than 0.25%, as the Federal Reserve took dramatic action to prevent a depression by increasing the money supply through lowering short-term interest rates. The crowding out of private investment due to government borrowing to finance expenditures appears to have been suspended after the Great Recession. The interest rate connection. Assume that government borrowing of substantial amounts will have an effect on the quantity of private investment. How will this affect interest rates in financial markets? In Figure 31.8, the original equilibrium E0, where the demand curve D0 for financial capital intersects with the supply curve S0, occurs at an interest rate of 5% and an equilibrium quantity equal to 20% of GDP. However, as the government budget deficit increases, the demand curve for financial capital shifts from D0 to D1. The new equilibrium E1 occurs at an interest rate of 6% and an equilibrium quantity of 21% of GDP. The graph plots the downward-sloping demand and upward-sloping supply of financial capital. The y-axis is the interest rate, also known as the price of financial capital, and the x-axis shows the quantity of financial capital as a percentage of GDP. An increase in government borrowing increases the quantity of financial capital demanded at all interest rates. This is a rightward shift in the demand for financial capital. The graph shows that the equilibrium interest rate will rise. Figure 31. 8 budget deficits and interest rates in the financial market. An increase in government borrowing can shift the demand curve for financial capital to the right from D0 to D1. As the equilibrium interest rate shifts from E0 to E1, the interest rate rises from 5% to 6% in this example. The higher interest rate is one economic mechanism by which government borrowing can crowd out private investment. A survey of economic studies on the connection between government borrowing and interest rates in the U.S. economy suggests that an increase of 1% in the budget deficit will lead to a rise in interest rates of between 0.5 and 10%, other factors held equal. In turn, a higher interest rate tends to discourage firms from making physical capital investments. One reason government budget deficits crowd out private investment, therefore, is the increase in interest rates. There are, however, economic studies that show a limited connection between the two, at least in the United States. But as the budget deficit grows, the dangers of rising interest rates become more real. At this point, you may wonder about the Federal Reserve. After all, can the Federal Reserve not use expansionary monetary policy to reduce interest rates, or in this case, to prevent interest rates from rising? This useful question emphasizes the importance of considering how fiscal and monetary policies work in relation to each other. Imagine a central bank faced with a government that is running large budget deficits, causing a rise in interest rates and crowding out private investment. If the budget deficits are increasing aggregate demand when the economy is already producing near potential GDP, threatening an inflationary increase in price levels, the central bank may react with a contractionary monetary policy. In this situation, the higher interest rates from the government borrowing would be made even higher by contractionary monetary policy, and the government borrowing might crowd out a great deal of private investment. Alternatively, if the budget deficits are increasing aggregate demand when the economy is producing substantially less than potential GDP, an inflationary increase in the price level is not much of a danger, and the central bank might react with expansionary monetary policy. In this situation, higher interest rates from government borrowing would be largely offset by lower interest rates from expansionary monetary policy, and there would be little crowding out of private investment. However, even a central bank cannot erase the overall message of the national savings and investment identity. If government borrowing rises, then private investment must fall, or private saving must rise, or the trade deficit must rise. By reacting with contractionary or expansionary monetary policy, the central bank can only help to determine which of these outcomes is likely. Public investment in physical capital. Government can invest in physical capital directly. Roads and bridges, water supply and sewers, seaports and airports, schools and hospitals, plants that generate electricity like hydroelectric dams or windmills, telecommunications facilities, and military weapons. In 2021, the United States spent about $146 billion on transportation, including highways, mass transit, and airports. Table 31. 1 shows the federal government's total outlay for 2021 for major public physical capital investment in the United States. We have omitted physical capital related to the military or to residences where people live from this table, because the focus here is on public investments that have a direct effect on raising output in the private sector. Type of public physical capital federal outlays 2014, federal outlays 2021. Transportation $91, 915 $146, 156. Community and regional development $20, 670 $83, $619. Natural resources and the environment $36, 170 $140, $691. Education, training, employment, and social services $90, 615 $236, 723. Other $37, 280 $241, $227. Total $276, 653 $548, 416. Table 31. 1 Grants for major physical capital investment 2014 and 2021 in millions. Source: Bureau of Economic Analysis, Table 315-5, https apps b gov/itable/index. CFM. Public physical capital investment of this sort can increase the economy's output and productivity. An economy with reliable roads and electricity will be able to produce more. However, it is hard to quantify how much government investment in physical capital will benefit the economy, because government responds to political as well as economic incentives. When a firm makes an investment in physical capital, it is subject to the discipline of the market. If it does not receive a positive return on investment, the firm may lose money or even go out of business. In some cases, lawmakers make investments in physical capital as a way of spending money in key politicians' districts. The result may be unnecessary roads or office buildings. Even if a project is useful and necessary, it might be done in a way that is excessively costly, because local contractors who make campaign contributions to politicians appreciate the extra business. Alternatively, governments sometimes do not make the investments they should because a decision to spend on infrastructure does not need to just make economic sense. It must be politically popular as well. Managing public investment cost-effectively can be difficult. If a government decides to finance an investment in public physical capital with higher taxes or lower government spending in other areas, it need not worry that it is directly crowding out private investment. Indirectly, however, higher household taxes could cut down on the level of private savings available and have a similar effect. If a government decides to finance an investment in public physical capital by borrowing, it may end up increasing the quantity of public physical capital at the cost of crowding out investment in private physical capital, which could be more beneficial to the economy. Public investment in human capital. In most countries, the government plays a large role in society's investment in human capital through the education system. A highly educated and skilled workforce contributes to a higher rate of economic growth. For the low-income nations of the world, additional investment in human capital seems likely to increase productivity and growth. For the United States, critics have raised tough questions about how much increases in government spending on education will improve the actual level of education. Among economists, discussions of education reform often begin with some uncomfortable facts. As Figure 31.9 shows, total federal spending in the U.S. for kindergarten through grade 12, K-12, increased substantially in nominal dollars through 2010, declined slightly in 2011 and 2012, and began rising again after that through 2020. However, as measured by standardized tests like the SAT, the level of student academic achievement has barely budged in recent decades. On international tests, U.S. students lag behind students from many other countries. Of course, test scores are an imperfect measure of education for a variety of reasons. It would be difficult, however, to argue that there are not real problems in the U.S. education system and that the tests are just inaccurate. This graph illustrates government spending on education over time. The y-axis measures spending in billions of dollars, from 0 to 800, in increments of 100 billion. The x-axis shows years, from 1998 to 2020. The line increases over time, from slightly over $300 billion in 1998 to a plateau of around $550 billion in 2009. It is roughly constant here until 2012, then it rises again to $700 billion in 2019. Figure 31. 9 total spending for elementary, secondary, and vocational education, 1998-2020. In the United States, the graph shows that government spending on education was continually increasing up until 2008, where it leveled off until 2010, then declined slightly in 2011 and 2012. Since 2012, spending has steadily increased. Source: Federal Reserve Economic Data, FRED, https, Fred, S.D. Lewis. Org Series G160291A027 and BEA. The fact that increased financial resources have not brought greater measurable gains in student performance has led some education experts to question whether the problems may be due to structure, not just to the resources spent. Other government programs seek to increase human capital either before or after the K-12 education system. Programs for early childhood education, like the federal Head Start program, are directed at families where the parents may have limited educational and financial resources. Government also offers substantial support for universities and colleges. For example, in the United States, about 60% of students take at least a few college or university classes beyond the high school level. In Germany and Japan, about half of all students take classes beyond the comparable high school level. In the countries of Latin America, only about 1 student in 4 takes classes beyond the high school level, and in the nations of sub-Saharan Africa, only about 1 student in 20. Not all spending on educational human capital needs to happen through the government. Many college students in the United States pay a substantial share of the cost of their education. If low-income countries of the world are going to experience a widespread increase in their education levels for grade school children, government spending seems likely to play a substantial role. For the U.S. economy and for other high-income countries, the primary focus at this time is more on how to get a bigger return from existing spending on education and how to improve the performance of the average high school graduate, rather than dramatic increases in education spending. How fiscal policy can improve technology. Research and development (R&D) efforts are the lifeblood of new technology. According to the National Science Foundation, federal outlays for research, development, and physical plant improvements to various governmental agencies have remained at an average of 8% of GDP. About 1/5 of U.S. R&D spending goes to defense and space-oriented research. Although defense-oriented R&D spending may sometimes produce consumer-oriented spin-offs, R&D that is aimed at producing new weapons is less likely to benefit the civilian economy than direct civilian R&D spending. Fiscal policy can encourage R&D using either direct spending or tax policy. Government could spend more on the R&D that it carries out in government laboratories, as well as expanding federal R&D grants to universities and colleges, nonprofit organizations, and the private sector. By 2014, the federal share of R&D outlays totaled $135.5 billion, or about 4% of the federal government's total budget outlays, according to data from the National Science Foundation. Fiscal policy can also support R&D through tax incentives, which allow firms to reduce their tax bill as they increase spending on research and development. Summary of fiscal policy: investment and economic growth. Investment in physical capital, human capital, and new technology is essential for long-term economic growth, as Table 31, 2 summarizes. In a market-oriented economy, private firms will undertake most of the investment in physical capital, and fiscal policy should seek to avoid a long series of outsized budget deficits that might crowd out such investment. We will see the effects of many growth-oriented policies very gradually over time. As students are better educated, we make physical capital investments, and man invents and implements new technologies. Physical capital, human capital, new technology. Private sector, new investment in property and equipment, on-the-job training, research and development. Public sector, public infrastructure, public education, job training, research and development, encouraged through private sector incentives and direct spending. Table 31. 2. Investment role of public and private sector in a market economy. Bring it home. Financing higher education. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, between 1980 and 2020, the average tuition and fees at a 4-year public university increased from $738 to $9,349. This represents a more than 12-fold increase in this 40-year period. To put this increase into perspective, median yearly household income in the U.S. has increased from about $20,000 to $67,000 during the same time, about a 3-5-fold increase. Clearly, college is becoming increasingly expensive, even as it continues to provide the same benefits that were mentioned at the beginning of this chapter by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Crucial to the mission of higher education is the Pell Grant Program, which was initiated by President Johnson as part of the Higher Education Act of 1965. But Pell Grant amounts have not adequately kept up with the rising costs of college tuition and fees. As part of President Joe Biden's Build Back Better proposal, the maximum Pell Grant award would increase to $7,045 between 2022-2025, representing an 8.5% increase, which is one of the largest one-year increases in the last 20 years. The largest increase occurred between 2009 and 2010, during President Barack Obama's term in office. The original proposal also aimed to allow for deferred action for Childhood Arrivals Program participants to benefit from the awards through 2030.